Hello and welcome to another video tutorial by Easy Academy. In this particular video, I'm going to be covering the performance environment setup that we're going to be using for benchmarking Apache Kafka through different scenarios. In the subsequent video, we're going to be covering some of the configurations, and then I will walk you through specific examples for latency, for throughput, for durability and availability. In the previous video, we covered these scenarios and what they mean and why they are important to certain use cases and to certain people that are using Apache Kafka. Now in this video, the main focus is just going to be how we're setting up the environment to do our testing for these different scenarios. All the different testing, evaluation and the comparison of the different scenarios will happen in subsequent videos in this series. So let's get started with the agenda for this particular video. Now the outline is that we're going to be reviewing today's setup, and then I will walk you through the two cluster types that I'm going to be using for these particular testing scenarios. One of them would be running Kafka with Zookeeper, and the other one will be running Kafka without Zookeeper. Then I will take a look at the producer client that is generating the load that we're doing testing with, and then we'll take a look at the other side of the coin, which is the consumer client that is going to be picking up the records from the Kafka brokers. And then we'll review the four scenarios again in case you're not familiar with what we're covering in this video, and then I will walk you through the setup of everything from the broker to the producer to the consumer and all the different supporting tools that are available to help us run this. Now we're going to be doing this on Kubernetes clusters because I consider doing this with my other setups. If you're familiar with my videos, I have a setup that runs Kafka on containers in Docker locally, where I use Docker Compose to run all these different setups. I also have another one that runs it on Kubernetes clusters locally, and then I have another one that runs Kubernetes clusters in the cloud on Microsoft Azure. So all these different environments are to help you interact with and understand how to set up Kafka in any environment you're doing development, whether it is for local development with Docker or Kubernetes, or whether it's in the cloud with just Kubernetes Helm charts. Now the link for all these videos are going to be in the description, so if you want to find out how to set it up on all these different scenarios, you can use the links in the description to find out how to do that yourself. So that is covered in the previous videos, and then the link to the previous video that I did before this particular video will also be in the description if you're interested in finding out what I discussed in that one. And then we're going to go into the details of the different cluster types. So the first cluster type is going to be the one with Zookeeper. So with this particular cluster type, I will have one instance of Zookeeper, and then I will have 3 instances of Kafka. So let's briefly take a look at that config to see how it is set up. So in the clusters that we have the Helm chart here. So this particular setup here is going to be just for Zookeeper, just one node. Now we are able to control the number of CPUs, we're able to control the number of RAM, how much memory we're allocating to this particular container to run on Kubernetes. So that's going to be one important thing, because I need to be able to control that the storage, the disk storage, the number of CPUs and the RAM. So that will be configured, and then this particular container will be able to do that. And this will be using the Azure storage in the cloud. And then we have these other 3 nodes. The first one is the broker, the second one is another broker, and the third one is another broker. So if you take a look at my tutorial on Kafka in a box, which the link is in the description, you will be able to see how to set up all these different nodes, and that video walks you through everything you need to configure. The only thing that is different for this video is that I'm using Kafka 3.1, and in the previous videos I believe I used Kafka 2.8 or Kafka 3.0 to do those tutorials. So that is the first scenario. The next one that we are going to cover is going to be the Kafka without Zookeeper. So this is also called Kafka running in craft mode, where instead of using Zookeeper for the metadata store, we're using Kafka brokers that are called controllers to store. So we're using Kafka nodes called controllers to store this metadata. So the controllers replace Zookeeper in the previous setup, and they're being used as part of the cluster to keep store of what is happening with the consumers, what is happening with the topics, and all those different settings, who's the leader, and all those different metadata are stored by the controllers. So for this particular setup, we have six nodes. The first 3 nodes are going to be serving as controllers, which are going to be storing the metadata for the cluster. And then the next 3 nodes are going to be storing the actual topic data inside the cluster. So I have nodes 1, 2, 3 that are going to be serving as controllers, and then I have nodes 4, 5, 6 that are going to be serving as brokers to store the actual topic data. So that's one thing that we are going to be reviewing here. If you want to take a look at the previous videos and the GitHub link called Kafka in the Box, that shows you how to set up everything, and that's the same set of Helm charts we're using for this particular setup. Now that we've covered the brokers, let's take a look at the producers themselves. So we have the performance producer, which is part of the Kafka open source project itself. So if we take a look at the performance producer, we have inside the bin folder, we have this file called Kafka Producer Performance Test.sh. Now what this is doing is it's just calling the Kafka run class script, and that is using a Java class called performance producer or producer performance. I'm not sure why they're calling it like that. And that class is also part of the Kafka package, which allows you to specify different settings. And then those settings include things like the producer config file, the topics, how many records you want to generate, the size of each record, and other configuration parameters that can be passed into that particular script. Now, we're not done here, because we have our own wrapper that we're going to be using as part of this testing to keep track of what is going on. And then we're going to be using the performance producer. So we have a performance entry point that will accept either producer or consumer, and then depending on whether you're doing producer or consumer, that argument would trigger one of these scripts called producer entry point or consumer entry point. So either the producer entry point or the consumer entry point will be invoked, and then once the producer entry point is invoked, then we use the script from the open source project to do our testing. So all these different setups will be captured: the properties file, the topic, how many records, the record size, and the throughput are going to be captured from the Kubernetes job, and then that will be used to invoke this particular script. So for the producer job, we have different Helm charts that are being used for that. So if we take a look at the Helm chart here, the producer job has all these different settings, where in the values file, we are capturing the properties file for the producer, the topic name, the number of records, the record size, and the throughput, and even the amount of memory while allocating to this particular producer. Similarly, on the other side, we have the consumer job that is going to be allowing us to retrieve data. So this consumer job is going to be picking up and invoking a similar script that will call the performance consumer, and the performance consumer will go ahead and retrieve that data. So let's take a look at the performance consumer as well. So that is also a bash script that is calling a scalar class called consumer performance, and that scalar class has similar capabilities like the producer, which allows you to specify the topic, to specify the bootstrap server. So you have the bootstrap list, you have the topic you're connecting to, you have the consumer group name, you have the fetch size for each of the polling and retrieval of data, and then you also have the consumer config, the ability to specify the consumer config. So that is something that is invoked by this particular consumer job, and then downstream we are picking up the consumer entry point here to invoke the consumer performance test, and then that is invoking the script that we saw earlier inside here. So once we have all these things set up, the next thing that we're going to be doing is, so we covered the producer, we covered the consumer. The next thing we're going to be reviewing is we have different setups for different use cases. So for latency, we're going to be passing in a specific configuration file that will be running through latency, and then throughput has its own config files for settings that optimize the producer and the consumer for throughput, and then durability and availability is also one of the scenarios we're considering. So all these 4 scenarios are going to be controlled specifically by each of the jobs if we take a look at the Helm charts. So coming back to this template, the producer config has a config map. Now a config map is a capability in Kubernetes that allows you to specify certain configurations dynamically inside the container that is running within the pods of the Kubernetes cluster. So in there we have the default setup, which will be kind of like the baseline, and then we also have different config files for latency, for throughput, for durability, and for availability. That's on the producer side. On the consumer side, we also have similar files as well. We have the default, we have the one for latency, throughput, durability, and availability. So all these things will be used to run the configs and to configure what we're doing inside the cluster. For each of the workloads, I will specify the scenario, and the scenario would use the specific config file for each of these use cases, and then the properties file for the producer will be loaded for that performance producer, and that will be used to run the job. And then for the consumer, the performance script would also use the specific config files for that and run it appropriately. So I wanted to make sure that I have this overview of how we're setting up the Kafka cluster, how we're setting up the producer, and how we're setting up the consumer. One thing that is going to stand out is that this is a job, and the job in Kubernetes has something called parallelism. So because of this, we're going to be able to run one producer, 2 producer, and multiple producers on the data generation side. Similarly, on the consumer side, we're going to also have levels of parallelism where we can run one or more consumers and be able to see how these things behave when we have one consumer and multiple consumers, and also how it behaves when we have one producer and multiple producers. Now, in each of these setups, we'll have varying degree of partitions, varying degree of record sizes, record counts, and all those different things. So I look forward to walking you through how to do this and walk through all these different testing scenarios. The first part of the testing will be just the benchmark using all the default values that we have. And then the subsequent videos will focus on each scenario, one on latency, one on durability, one on availability, and then one on throughput, all the 4 scenarios. And then in these scenarios, we'll walk you through different varying numbers of producers, consumers, partition sizes, and all the different combinations. I think this is going to be a very interesting video series because it's going to help you to understand how to configure your environment to match your specific needs and specific scenarios. So that was everything in terms of the overall setup for today. Now, for next steps, we have the configurations for different scenarios, and then we'll run the benchmark scenario, the default scenario, and then we'll also run the 4 other scenarios that we have for latency, throughput, durability, and availability. Each one will be done in Zookeeper mode as well as Zookeeperless mode, which is craft node, the new one with Keep 500. So that's everything for this particular video. If you like this channel, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, click on the notification icon, and then also like this video and recommend it to anyone you think will benefit from it. You can also support the channel by joining Patreon to become a patron, and then follow me on Twitter and check out my website at Easy Academy for upcoming content that I have from time to time. Now, this is a course that covers data and how to use open source projects like Apache Kafka to process data, to store data, to analyze data, and to visualize data. If you're interested in these kind of topics, please go ahead and check out the course, which the link will be on the description. And I also have a coupon code for 10% off, where you can leverage that to get a discount on the sign up. I thank you very much for watching this video. I look forward to showing you all the different scenarios in the subsequent videos for this series. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.